Hi, my name is Barry Horner, and I'm your host on today's episode of Stake and Soul, the podcast that's dedicated to demystifying the world of employee ownership. Stake refers not just to the financial or beneficial ownership, but also to the vested interest, the sense of responsibility, and the feeling of belonging that comes with being an employee owner. Soul is all about company culture, the values, the shared purpose, and the human connection that are amplified and shaped by employee ownership. Soul is the company's silent language. Join us for Series 1 as we sit down with business leaders and CEOs who have successfully navigated their journey to employee ownership. Today we are joined by a man who has spent 30 years valuing human connection and character more than material luxury and status symbols. Alastair Sawday is the founder of Sawdays, a business that began in 1994 as a collection of scruffy notes from a French walking tour and grew into Britain's most trusted authority on special places to stay. But Alastair has never been a typical businessman. From running disaster relief in Turkey to standing as a parliamentary candidate for the Green Party, his career has been a series of circuitous routes driven by a deep dislike of conventional tourism. In 2018, Alastair made the move that redefined the culture and soul of his company. Instead of selling to the highest bidder, he pioneered a unique hybrid ownership model, selling 52% of the business to the employees, 24% to the Charitable Trust, ensuring that Sawdays would remain a force for good in perpetuity. We're here today to talk about the courage to stay small while thinking big, the ethics of travel in a fragile world, and what happens when a founder decides to truly let go. Alastair, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So let's go back to those scruffy notes and what led up to Sawdays. As I think, if you're a Bristol person, a lot of people would know Sawdays really well, but just take us on that journey of what led to the Sawdays business from that little scruffy notebook right at the start of your journey.
Oh my goodness. Well, interesting that mention of scruffy notebooks reminds me of the Rough Guides, when Mark Ellingham pottered around Greece, made a few scruffy notes, and that eventually became a very successful series. And I think the same with Lonely Planet. Mine was more a question of a series of addresses and memories and names in my filing system after running a small travel company. For about, I don't know, 5 or 10 years, I ran a little company which took small groups, maybe 6, 8 people, off the beaten track in Europe, mainly France and Spain and Italy and England. And I was determined to get them totally away from conventional tourism. So we'd stay in private houses, use the tiny roads of France and Italy, do interesting things like have concerts in chapels run by local amateur musicians. We did all sorts of extraordinary things that enabled us to get a feel for the country and to meet people. And I had their names and contacts sitting on my desk. And one day a friend who claimed to be running away from the FBI and hotly pursued by them, in fact,
Right.
burst into my office desperate for a job. Couldn't think what to do. And then she spotted a file of these addresses in my file and said, "What about those?" Between us, somehow we decided to put a book together, which was quite amusing because I said, "Well, let's do France," and she said, "I don't speak French." Didn't like France, didn't get on particularly well with the French, and hadn't done any writing. So she was a terrific candidate. Works a treat.
When was that, just in terms of time framing?
That was the early 90s, but our first book came out in 1994. But of course, the publishing company was the end of a very long journey, as everybody's experiences are. One thing builds on another. But it began long ago, I suppose, when I was a child, traveling.
And what was the rationale for doing something that was quite unconventional in terms of the way that you were approaching tourism? Was back in that time quite, very unusual. What was it? Is that a reflection of you as an individual, or what was the motivation for doing that?
I think you have to understand first, I'm not a businessman by training or by inclination. I just do projects and run campaigns. So I suppose the first book was a project, really. I had calculated it to be a profitable enterprise. But what drove me, in part, was my experience in life, but also running my little travel company, with the enormity of the horror that is modern tourism. I hate it. I despair of what damage tourism does to the world. So many of the people in tourism are good people who don't think about what they're doing. I mean, the cruise industry, for example. I mean, what an environmental, social catastrophe that is. Vast hotels, the unstoppable growth of the airline industry, just ferrying people back and forth across the world just to have a good time. It's a sort of tragedy, and it's also incredibly destructive to community, to I think also to international relationships in many ways. I don't buy into this idea that tourism is automatically a good thing. There are many better things, and the better thing is travel.
Sure. You say you're not a businessman, and I get the context in where you're coming from. But at the end of the day, you have built a very good and very successful business. What was the catalyst for the change from thinking you were just going with a few people to France, having a good time, certainly giving your customers a wonderful time and experience, but suddenly you think, actually, there's now a few people sitting at the table. It is more than me. I am actually building a business here. What was again, just in terms of building up to the final decision that you made then to go employee owned, which we can come on to, but just to give listeners a sense of, how the business built over time. So it was you originally with a wonderful idea of doing something markedly different in the travel world. How did the business grow, and how did you start taking people on, and how did it sort of flourish and become what it is known as today?
Yeah, I hadn't really pondered that. Well, the catalyst was that visit by my friend Jane Ryder looking for a job.
Right.
And out of it came a book, which I thought of as a separate project. And once she'd gone and it had been published, I imagined it would all be over. But that first book, for some strange reason, hit a magical spot. It must have caught England at exactly the time when enough people were tiring of not being able to do their own thing in Europe. I think package tours weren't quite so popular. There was a growing sort of educated group of folk who wanted to know more, and we provided them with a safe, a safe pair of hands to advise them. So, if we recommend Monsieur, Madame Dupont in such and such a farm in Provence, go and stay there. You'll have a great time. That was a safe recommendation. They could go and stay there, and whoops, they discovered that they were loving it. They were loving speaking French, which they'd forgotten. They were loving a sort of immersion into a little corner of France. So we just did the right thing at the right time. So the book took off. We sold 12,000 copies of the first book and quickly reprinted another 12,000, which are astonishing numbers for a travel guide. And lo and behold, we discovered we had a publishing company. So I rapidly let go of the travel company, which is hard work, dealing with human beings in the flesh and satisfying all their longings and dealing with their worries. So the publishing company was born quite by chance, really, and by that first initial success, for which I had not planned at all. All the people who worked in the travel company stayed on and worked in the publishing company. People who had been writing brochures and writing letters became editors. We were slowly. So how many people did we have? Maybe we had about a dozen people at the time. And the woman who first came to me as a bilingual secretary, Annie, she stayed on and eventually became the managing editor of the publishing company. We recruited people who spoke French and Spanish and Italian. Most of the recruits were friends or friends of friends. And we interviewed people. We interviewed them for their writing skills, their language skills, their personal skills, and their characters. We wanted, it sort of grew in a family, informal, rather haphazard way.
Right.
We produced good books. In spite of all that, we produced really beautiful books.
And then I guess at some point on the journey, you must have started to think that the business has grown, despite you professing not to be a business person. There was some success there. Certainly in publishing, huge success in terms of the numbers of people reading the books. But there must have been a sort of dawning reality at some point of, I have now built this business. It's of value. How do I get out of the business? Do I retire? Do I sell the business? What was going through your mind at that time that then crystallized your thinking in, actually, no, a trade sale really isn't for me. There has to be a better way. What led up to that pivotal aha moment when you just thought, I need to do something?
There was no critical moment. I think it was a long process of pondering the nature of the business I was in, gradually growing older and beginning to be aware that an exit was important, being told by one or two advisors that I had to think about an exit, and then recoiling to some extent from the conventional pattern of people building up a business and then flogging it off as much as they could and walking away from it, leaving it to its own fate. And as I built up something which I so clearly identified with, it mattered to me greatly what happened to the business and the people in it. All the time I've been running the business, I was also doing other things like being a trustee of the Soil Association. And we always had our roots pretty deep in the community in one way or another. So I was subject to a huge range of outside interest, external influence. I didn't mingle with business people on the whole. I tended to mingle more with ecologists, environmentalists, social entrepreneurs, people who were doing interesting stuff in their communities. And I was an environmentalist. You have to remember, this is a key thing. You have to remember that was my passion underlying everything I did, and it remains so. So while I was running a business, I was still standing as a Green for Parliament. As a Green, I was standing for local authority and local council. And those values, which I took with me in the political campaigning and the organic movement, informed what I did with the business, if you like.
Right.
So I've got a little quote I can give you here, which may help you understand. I wrote a charter for the company when I passed it over to employee ownership. In the introduction, this is what I wrote. Recently in Bristol, developers destroyed the exquisite Jacobean ceiling of a small and little-known ancient house in the centre, converting it for student flats. This was done just before historic England was due to visit, with a view to listing the building. This is an unremarkable story of business coming before principle. No law was broken, yet every ethical consideration was affronted. The company clearly has a culture at odds with what most of us consider decent. Business so often behaves as if it were outside the community. I wish Sawdays to be a small part of the reshaping of business culture. So that really informed everything I thought about making an exit. I hadn't worked out what to do. I talked about employee incentive schemes, and I was going to speak to accountants and advisors, and they all came up with plans that would make as much money as possible, and which were complicated financial plans. And then one day I went to a lecture in Bristol, and it was about a Palestinian doctor whose family, wife and 3 daughters, were destroyed by an Israeli shell coming into his apartment. And he continued to work as a doctor in Israel, working for Israeli patients. I was so moved by that story that I talked to him afterwards, and I was joined by a very assertive, retired businessman called Andrew Radford. And we fell into conversation, and I enjoyed him enormously. And he advised me to read a book by David Airedale, which many of you listening to this podcast will know. And it was called Beyond the Corporation. And it blew me away. I was seriously excited. Then I think he wrote another book, didn't he? But he examined the impact of employee ownership all over Europe.
Yeah, I think he did. I'm still on the first book you've
Right.
just recommended, but yes, I believe he did.
That's right. He did. I think he surveyed employee ownership. He did an academic course at Edinburgh University after he sold his business, and the impact of employee ownership struck me as quite remarkable. For example, life expectancy in employee ownership companies tended to be higher than elsewhere. I was very moved by all that, so I began to get in touch with the employee ownership associations, and the rest is history. Yeah.
I guess for you, Alastair, from what you've just shared, the idea of keeping your business local, as opposed to, for all the other reasons you wouldn't have wanted to do a trade sale, but the idea of, and certainly that's been an important thing for me as a Bristol-centric business, Paradigm Norton. The idea of selling to someone, for all the reasons I wouldn't have wanted to do that, but I didn't want to lose, the head office in Bristol would have probably lost half the team. And I felt it was really important to retain the team in Bristol. And I guess for you, from a social perspective, that was also, must have been it's not something we particularly talked about on the podcast, but coming on and having you and I chatted beforehand, I just thought that would be a significant factor in your decision to you are a Bristol-based business, really keep it local. And I guess that's the answer. But any thoughts around that?
Interesting. Yes, one extra thought is we paid a lot of attention to the way our offices looked and felt physically. So we had several offices. We started off in a small Victorian terraced house, illegally, with 14 of us crammed into these tiny rooms, which we loved. Then we moved out to a farm, which we rented, where we rented a barn. And that was an introduction to life in the countryside for an office. It was terrific. Then we bought our own barns just outside Bristol, which were eco barns. We had a green oak timber barn built as a bridge between other barns. And it was a very beautiful, ecologically satisfying site. We won Queen's Award for Sustainability. It was great. The pond where we used to swim at lunchtime. So the quality of the office environment mattered, and we created this. So all that sort of stuff mattered. Then we moved into Bristol, where we took a very unpleasant 1960s office building, and we did remarkable things with it inside. It made it look like a French cafe. We had a grand piano in the middle of the offices. It was just delightful, which is where it still is. Unfortunately, without the grand piano, which is now in a church in Bristol. But yes, so we had beautiful spaces which were meant to make people feel better about going to work. And that did matter. And the people, the relationships, they mattered greatly to us.
Yeah. So a decision at some point gets made. You've met and heard about employee ownership, and you think, absolutely, this is the route for me for all the reasons you've articulated. How did you go about communicating that to your team, to clients and others? What was that process like?
I was rather hoping you weren't going to ask me that. Because it's a matter of embarrassment to me and a touch of shame. I'll protect myself a little bit by going back and saying I would go quite frequently to employee ownership conferences. And everyone knew I was doing this, and I would take some employees along with me. And these are conferences where I met the most remarkable people, as you know. First, they struck me as a very corporate and normal in truly horrible places. But the people there were just magnificent exemplars of the values that they profess to hold to. So there was employee ownership sort of in the conversation, but I didn't really do what I should have done. You could say it's me being typically iconoclastic. I just did my own thing. You could say it was laziness, intellectual laziness, or business management laziness. But I just explored the idea with a legal advisor and other people in the EO world, and then sort of dumped it, if you like, on the employees. I mean, they all knew it was happening, but it wasn't formally consulted upon. So I should. I mean, I can say now all the sort of things I should have done. I've had regular meetings and training sessions, and we should have got outside help. Didn't really do any of those things. I just decided this is what I wanted to do, and you could say this is classic reflection of my slightly patriarchal approach to the company. But I failed to do all the proper things. And has the company suffered as a result? I'm now not in it, so I don't know really. But we can talk about that later.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And thank you for being just so honest and candid on that, because I think, again, one of the things I want to hopefully communicate in the podcast is how would you do things differently next time? It's easy to say, oh yeah, we did a full consultation, we got everybody together, we did it over 18 months. That's sort of what good looks like. And there are businesses that have done that, but equally learning from, I wish I'd done it a different way, is actually hugely valuable to people going down this journey.
Yeah.
So at some point you meet with the lawyers, you decide what you're going to do, you go back to the office and you sort of say, got some great news, or however it was communicated. So when it became known within the business, I mean, I guess there probably is a sigh of relief. People knowing you would probably assume that you weren't going to just sell out to the highest bidder. But when people eventually got to understand what it meant and that they'd become beneficial owners in the business, presumably there was a great sense of relief and appreciation of what you've done. Would that be true?
Well, I think so. Yes, I mean, most of the signalling was from individuals I knew well. It wasn't as a result of polling and opinion collecting. I'm pretty sure that it was received really, really well. I think the idea of electing an employee council and doing the hustings for that and all the paraphernalia that goes with the exercise of democracy, I think that stuff went down well. And I don't remember any negativity about it. There might have been since then a touch of negativity about the meetings, the time spent, the extra burden on those involved. But I think generally speaking, people are proud to be part of an employee-owned company, as they are proud to be part of a B Corp and to win prizes for their sustainability. They're proud of these things, I think, now.
Yeah. You were fairly early on in the move to employee ownership, March 2018, exactly a year before us. And certainly when we were looking in 2017-18, there weren't a lot of employee-owned businesses out there, and we slightly struggled in knowing who to go to for legal professional advice. How did you find the market a year before in 2018? Was it difficult for you to actually find people who really knew EO, or again, through conversations, going to EOA conference, was it sort of an obvious route?
The EOA was hugely helpful in the early stage. I had interesting contacts. I did a lot, looking back on it now, I'm beginning to understand how much ranging about and seeking opinion I actually did. I did a lot. For example, there were one or two businesses around Bristol from which I took advice. Small engineering business in Weston-super-Mare and so on and so forth. There were very few businesses in Bristol itself, I think. So it was the contacts I'd had with EO people, personal advice from EO companies, reading about it, There were one or two companies in London I took a lot of advice from. I simply can't remember their names now, in the EO world. And then endless conversation about it with our lawyer in Bristol. Now, he was an extremely able advocate and counsellor who saw himself as beginning to carve out a career in employee ownership advising in Bristol, which I think he's done.
Mm.
And he buried himself in the cerebral side of it, and we had lots of long conversations. I also had a lot of support from my chair, Andrew Radford, who was a very solid Christian businessman who had been managing large manufacturing companies all his life and was firmly committed to supporting me in this search for the right way of exiting. And he drove me along when I was getting slow. I took a long time over it. He'd give me a kicking and say, "Come on, you've got to get on with it." And he was very excited about leaving his chairmanship just as the company became employee owned.
Right.
And
Right.
which worked. So it was random, if you like, but
Yeah.
more thorough possibly than I have acknowledged in the past. I did a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. I mean, that's really helpful advice to others. I think it's like, again, in some of the conversations I've had, people have done it in a very sort of siloed way. But there are over 2,000 employee-owned businesses out there, and certainly from my experience in reaching out to other businesses, they're very, very prepared to share the good and the not so good. So that's a good bit of advice. You mentioned we're moving into a bit of a conversation around corporate governance, and you said that clearly when you become employee owned, it does require a change. You need to introduce a trust board. What was the before and after structure of Sawdays in terms of, was it just simply a board that did both the sort of tactical day to day and the strategic that you led, and then it developed into then needing the trust board? To talk us through a little bit just in terms of those dynamics, and probably just a bit of a supplementary question is, you're a relatively small team, so maybe that it wasn't required, but certainly in our business, we have a separate group which we call Partner Voice, which sort of sits broadly within governance, but not within the official sort of governance structure. And that's our opportunity. Kim, who's our head of marketing, chairs that, and it's the opportunity really to hear across the business, in the mood music of the business, what's really going on at sort of grassroots level, and how do we appropriately feed that up to, could be the board, could be the trust board. Just a little bit of a, what's the structure of Sawdays? Is it working? Have you had to change it? That would be helpful to go there.
Yeah, it's good to think about this. So the structure was fairly conventional.
Right.
So I was the sole owner and the managing director, but we had a chair and we had a fairly conventional board with seriously professional outsiders on it. Then we had a management management committee or management group, which worked pretty traditionally and fairly successfully, I think. Very flat. We had a very flat hierarchy, very few titles. The company really operated as much on trust and personal relationships as it did on sort of business structure principles. But it was straightforward. And after employee ownership, then what happened? We then had an employee ownership trust, which technically is the main shareholder. He's occasionally doesn't interfere really most of the time. The board management structure continued really in much the same way, with an employee on the board of directors elected by the employee council, which in its turn was elected by the employees. I think since I've left, and since it became EO, I think it's become more business-like, more slightly less informal and familiar. So there's proliferation of titles. I think meetings are well, it's always a problem with any business, isn't it? The fabulous amounts of time wasted in meetings. But the structure, as you know from employee ownership, it doesn't really change the way businesses work particularly. It just
Sure.
changes the way voices and opinions flow within it.
Yeah.
So to all intents and purposes, it feels very much as it always was, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
And because you are a smaller business, you're not multi-site. I was talking with Nick Parsons yesterday at Parsons Bakery with 50 shops and 470 staff. Now that creates in of itself quite an interesting communication challenge when you want to get both information out and information back. In your setting, do you think post becoming employee owned, if the beneficial owners, the employees, genuinely had ideas, would that just filter up through the normal course of conversations to the CEO, or is there a sort of formal mechanism for hearing from them as owners of the business?
I think it's more formal.
Right.
I'm not sure how well it works informally.
Okay.
Again, it's slightly tricky because I'm not part of the business anymore.
No, sure. No, that's fine. Yeah.
But I'm not. I think one of the problems we've had as an employee-owned business, they've had, if you like, is that the employees are quite young and they're not experienced in the world of business. So in many ways, I think they've had to be helped quite a lot by the chief executive. And I'm not sure they've flexed their muscles much or had to. I don't know. This is a slightly grey area for me.
Okay. Yeah, fine.
Yes.
Well, one area I probably can take you back to, which I'm sure you'll be able to articulate the rationale for, is I guess you've got an unusual EO structure in terms of the amount that you sold. There was the percentage that went into the Charitable Foundation. And that's probably quite an unusual structure in terms of making a decision to put a pretty significant chunk of the business into a charitable foundation. Just talk through for those listening to the podcast, because again, quite often you've got a business where, again, Parsons Bakery, 100% went into the EOT. For us, it was 80%, and the only rationale for that was that I'd always believed in quite wide share ownership, and at the time we became employee-owned in 2019, we had a few people that had only just acquired shares, and we didn't want to mandate that they had to sell them, so they kept them. So we're 80% employee-owned, 20% still with the minority. But your structure is really quite different. We have a charitable foundation, but it doesn't own shares. So what was the motivation behind that, and has that worked out? And if you were advising or you were asked from another vendor of a business thinking about going down the route of employee ownership, would you counsel supportively of putting money into a charitable foundation? Has it sort of planned through as you had envisaged?
It was the structure. It was an unusual structure, and by the way, we might add that 24% also remains in the hands of the family in the shape of my son, who sits on the board. So it's an employee-owned charitable family company. The structure was it's sort of thing that emerged over time. Clearly the employees needed to have a majority, and a majority is anything, so let's say from 52% upwards. I wanted a charity to have an influence, not only to do good stuff with their share of the dividends, but to have an influence on the company, to ensure that over time, over decades possibly, that the company retain its values. So if, for example, there was a move to sell the employee shares, then the charity might have views on that, might have quite strong views. And the family connection is obvious. It's just maintaining the Sawday connection. So my main purpose was to maintain the values of the company. I was very worried about it just going the way of all flesh, and also doing rubbishy things. Really, I didn't want it to get into mass tourism or just to misbehave. So that struck me as a clever way of doing it, but I'm not sure how successful it's been. I was the chair of the trust, the Charitable Foundation, and I was not good at it. And we've now got another chair, my daughter-in-law, who's much better. How much influence we've had on the company, I don't know. I don't think we have had. We should have much more influence. We should be more engaged. And in fact, as I speak, we are, as trustees of the Charitable Foundation, gathering a determination to come back, as it were, into the company and to be more involved, to communicate much better what it is we're doing, who we're supporting with company money, remarkable people we're supporting, and possibly to have more influence on the direction of the company. I didn't do that well. Maybe it'll do it better now.
If you do it well, you would be an advocate of. Now, I'm just thinking of others that are looking at how to carve up the sort of how to create the right structure in an EO business going forward. So, as I say, in our business, we have a charitable foundation, but that's just essentially taking profits of the company and distributing them through a charitable foundation. We're not the actual fundamental ownership structure doesn't facilitate essentially them owning shares. But you were saying perhaps with the new chair doing it well, that can have perhaps the influence that you'd initially anticipated, and therefore you recommend it to others.
It's just my view, and I'm wide open to the possibility that every small business develops its own way, which is an exciting aspect of the sort of the ecosystem of business, really. You need people doing their own thing, don't you, and experimenting. So if, for example, we had created a charitable foundation which took a guaranteed percentage of the profits or fixed sum every year, then I suppose that would maintain the charitable input or output. But I suppose the way I thought about it originally, it would not maintain what I hoped would become the influence over the company.
Yes. Yeah, I'm with you.
So that we'd have to remember that was my prime purpose. It's a really interesting one. Over time, it'll emerge. It hasn't emerged really well, and I'm slightly ashamed to say, and that's my fault, I think. Partly because I left it. I'm quite old now, so I hadn't quite got the driving energy when I was chair of the trust that I had before. It needs a younger person, which we now have.
Yeah. Like you say, though, I mean, EO only really came in through the Nuttall Report coalition government in 2014. So, we're still in the bigger scheme of things for EO in its infancy. So it's interesting I think just to socialise these different models and for people to give some thought. I suspect there are people who are listening to the podcast contemplating going down the route of employee ownership that probably wouldn't have even given sort of charity a second thought. So I think that's been a really helpful conversation. In terms of the point.
Can I just quickly interrupt you?
Of course.
Just add one little note there. One of the aspects of the Charitable Foundation, which I find most exciting, is the content it gives us. It's given me and our trustees, and therefore, by extension, the company, if we communicate it properly, is contact with remarkable people. So, for example, I was very concerned about the way young activists in Extinction Rebellion were burning out. I met quite a few of them, and it was a heartbreaking thing to witness. These are young people who devoted their lives to this stuff and were exhausted. And a young woman in Bristol set up a charitable foundation to help them and turned them into people who could help others. And it was just thrilling to watch her grow, the organization grow with our money. Small sums of money, 10,000, 20,000. And that fed back into the foundation and back into the company in a way. So I think that's a really positive aspect of it. Sorry, I just wanted to say that.
Not at all. Thanks for sharing that. That's really, really interesting. I guess when you take a business down the route of becoming employee-owned, the employees become beneficial owners. You're encouraging them to have that owner mindset. And quite often what gets communicated if you're doing a profit share is an expectation around information, influence, and reward. So information, you're providing them with more information. It's now their business. Influence, you're hoping that as a result of them being a partner in a business that they'll think like a partner, and then the sort of reward for the first two comes through a profit share. In terms of information shared with the team, had you always as a business being quite open with how the business was doing, or was that quite a big change when you went down the route of employee ownership in terms of perhaps a bit more explanation on we're having a good year, we're not having a good year? How did you deal with that?
I think we'd always been very open. It would be ridiculous for me to say it was a network of equals, but we were, generally speaking, the people who ran the company at various levels we got on closely, and we were open with information. I think it's true to say. Now that's under EO, I confess I don't really know. I don't know if they're not privy to some of the company information. They damn well should be. I don't know. How strange. Reward, the other thing you asked about. They've had the employees ever since it became EO, generally speaking, had pretty good bonuses. And we bent over backwards. The company's bent over backwards to make sure they have had. It's been a priority. I do know that now. I mean, times are a bit tougher now.
Yeah, they are.
And I think they're still getting a bonus this year, but it's a very small one. So those bonuses must be backed by information. I mean, you don't drop from a big one to a small one without telling people why. So I imagine the information is better than I know. How well the reward system works, what it does psychologically to the employees, how it improves their performance, I don't know, but I've heard many times from them that just knowing that they're part of an employee-owned company does make them feel different, and they are proud to say it.
Great, thank you for that. I was just thinking back to the communication around, you said that actually going back, you'd have probably done it differently. And I think, as I've said, lots of people perhaps think that they could have done the communication better at the outset. That's the ownership transition bit. We're now going to become employee owned. There's also the leadership transition bit. And certainly for us, we decided the ownership transition was sort of onerous enough. We would separate out ownership, and we did that in 2019, but then left it till 2025 to do the leadership transition, when essentially I handed over the CEO role. Philippa took it on. What was that process like for you, Alastair? And again, I'd be interested to get your perspective on both the process of how you identified your successor, and then also how you felt about that. Because again, probably a bit like me, you'd set that business up. You know, at the start of the conversation, it was you with your little notebook going out doing stuff, not really thinking I'm growing a business. And then a few years later, you look around and you have grown a business, and it's of some value. But I suspect some of the stories, and again, having read your book, it felt very, very like a family. And there must have been a sense for you of, oh my goodness, you know, what does life look like beyond Sawday? So the two things really. How did you identify your successor? And were there very obvious people who were going to take the business over, and what was the sort of journey there? And then second, perhaps a bit of self-reflection on how you found that process, and would you do anything differently next time?
Moving on from owning it into another world was something I think I was fine with. I had a lot of engagement in the outside world. I wasn't abandoning the very essence of my purpose. How we actually did it, very conventionally. So I retired from being chair and became an MD, and then I retired from being MD and became just a board director. So my contact was as a director. I used to love going into board meetings. I enjoyed personal contact, and I enjoyed being able to contribute ideas, etc. We chose the chair in a fairly conventional way. We chose a woman to take over from Andrew Redford. I was unduly influenced by the fact she spoke French and played the piano. But she proved to be brilliant at taking us through the particularly grim time of COVID.
Right.
And we chose a an MD, again, in a fairly conventional way. And our MD has been a very fine, competent operator ever since. He's still there. So how did it, you asked how it felt and what the process was. So the process was conventional, unoriginal, I think.
Well, was it someone that you'd appointed that was already in Sawdays, or did you bring someone external into the business?
External, in both cases, chair and MD. I think we have, in one way in which I failed was I didn't bring enough outsiders in to the board. You have to remember that I was patriarchal. There's no question about it. I admit it. So I never minded really having to take decisions alone or with a small team of people. I didn't always relish having outsiders who didn't know the business coming in. But looking back on it, I think the business would have been better served by outside advice because the board did become overpopulated, probably with employees. You had an employee director, one or two employees were promoted up. So I think that's one mistake. More outside influence would have been a good thing. What else might I have done better in that process? Possibly I might have paid more attention to the retention of values and style, which I thought would just roll on, but they needed careful curating.
Sure.
I mean, in many ways they're still there. In some ways they're not. But as a personal process, it was relatively easy. Although I do remember that when it was finally suggested to me that my time had come, and I could see it. When I finally pressed the button to say that's all, it's all over, I'm having nothing. I remember bursting into tears. So it was quite an emotional moment.
Yeah. Did you, with the person that took over your new MD, did you sort of run in parallel, so to speak, to do a handover, or what was that actual process like? You recruit someone else, you're going to step back. Well, any thoughts around how to do that well, or not, as the case may be, as you reflect?
I don't think I've been very clear with myself or you that my son Toby took over as MD, and so the new MD took over directly from Toby. So I was just a board director. Toby, by the way, was trying to run the company with a pair of newly born twins and a working wife,
Right. Yes.
which was extremely tough, and he was very young. But he did a great job. But so the new one took over from him. It was a fairly straightforward switch. There wasn't much of a handover. Toby remained on the board, so he was there and available. But I think it's true to say that the new MD was competent enough and experienced enough to want to plough his own furrow very quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. In terms of, you've been really open around things that you might do differently. It's always a question I ask because I think for this podcast, I'm really keen that it's a warts and all podcast and not just EO's wonderful and there's no disadvantages. As you look back on the journey you've been on and to take us almost to present day, are there any other areas that you think I wish I'd done differently around this transition to employee ownership? Looking back, I think that we haven't already covered. Are there any obvious things there where you think, I think I missed a bit of a trick there?
I find that so hard to answer. I mean, of course, I could have done it infinitely better. We've talked about consultation, talking to the employees. I've talked about bringing in better outside EO values-based advice. One very clear failure we made because we were in a hurry. We were all in a hurry. Toby was keen to leave because he had children, and the creation of the Employee Ownership Trust, I did that. It worked okay, and it worked on trust, but I didn't do what I should have done. It should have had a totally independent board of trustees with very little connection to Sawdays. Whereas, in fact, the chair of Sawdays, the woman I talked about, what I thought at the time, very kindly offered to act as chair of the board of trustees of the EO Trust, which, strictly speaking, we shouldn't have done. We did make the lawyer who advised us. He stayed on board as trustee, and we had an employee. That's right, an employee representative, which doesn't sound too bad, but had to have the chair of the same organisations was a mistake, and we've only just rectified that. That I think was a serious failure. But at the time, because we knew our chair so well, we trusted her totally never to do anything rash or disastrous, which indeed she didn't. She was a safe pair of hands. But I think possibly one or two things which have emerged later as difficulties might well have been forestalled by a more attentive, detached chair.
Yeah. So you had an independent, but not an independent chair. So I guess there could be some challenging conflicts there that
Sure.
you recognised.
Yeah.
No, that's really helpful. Have you had any issues in? Again, I reflect on our business and other EO businesses where I think there's the challenge of paying out the deferred consideration is often one for the new team taking over. They've got to sort of grow a business, pay a profit share and pay out the deferred consideration. That's often hailed as a bit of a challenge. Sometimes it's the cadence of meetings, making sure if you have a board meeting where historically you might have made a board meeting, thought, right, let's crack on, decision made. And then you think, no, actually, that's a reserve matter. The trust board need to sign that off. That's another one. But another one that I often hear is the challenge of bringing in other senior people into an employee owned business, when perhaps they may have had an offer elsewhere of equity ownership and those sorts of things. Has that been an issue for you, do you think? And if it has, how have you overcome that?
I don't think that's been a problem.
No, okay.
We did lose a particularly wonderful senior manager recently to another employee-owned company who offered a much more.
That might come up.
Who offered a much more money. But to their credit, what perception they showed, and she's still involved, I think, in some way. That's right, I believe. I suppose again, this is not something I know a lot about, but I imagine it's always tricky to recruit good senior people into an employee-owned company who could earn much more money elsewhere. And maybe the employee ownership is an attraction to some and a deterrence to others. So I've forgotten what the rest of your question was.
No, it was just more around the challenges of recruiting good people, perhaps when they are given an alternative, which, I mean, I wasn't thinking of the individual you mentioned, but I was thinking of, sometimes, private equity, the opportunity to join an EO business or the opportunity to join a non-EO business where there's the opportunity of, significant equity ownership. I think does create a challenge. And I think people are resolving that in a variety of ways through things like EMI schemes. But I just wondered if that was an issue you'd identified at Sawdays or
I believe not.
No, okay.
But it must be an issue. I mean, interestingly, I think we're firmly committed to the notion that nobody coming in can buy shares.
Sure. Yeah.
Because the fairness and the equitability, if you like, of the equity of the company, the real equity, lies in the structure and the rewards and the ownership, which in theory is designed to take care of everybody's concerns, personal or general. But there will be a lot of people out there we are excluding. We're not knowing about their exclusion.
Sure.
Yeah.
I've got a couple of quick rapid fire questions coming up, but just before I ask that, coming on to the podcast today, and it's been lovely to have this conversation. Is there anything around the Sawday's journey that we haven't covered, that on reflection you think, why didn't Barry ask me about that? Or any other area that you have done that's sort of perhaps a bit unique to Sawday's, that it would be good to just sort of close off the podcast with? Think anything you've particularly done or that might be helpful to other people contemplating this journey?
Well, yeah, yes and no. I mean, in a way, something I'd like to emphasize for those listening is that running a business and making these decisions about ownership and future and exit, etc., it calls upon you as a historical, social, political animal very profoundly. And I found that my long life of engagement with a wider community in benign ways, if you like, has helped me hugely. I mean, I've fallen back on all the good people I've met, the fine examples of what I consider to be integrity and decency and kindness. And I've fallen back also on my growing, if you like, it's sort of intellectually based understanding of what's going on in the world. So, just to give you, this may strike you as very strange, Barry, but I really don't think it will, because you're part of this EO pattern. I was so often told, well, that's a very unusual way of doing things, or you're breaking the rules, or it's not the way things are done. So, with reference, for example, to the exit, surely it makes lots of sense. It's perfectly okay for you just to flog it for as much as possible and move on. Surely you should be pursuing much more vigorously some of the commercial opportunities that are out there. But the answer is no, not if the conventional world. I mean, the conventional world is fundamentally driven by a barbaric form of capitalism at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah.
Its roots are getting deeper and deeper into the great soil of humanity. And capitalism is failing us dreadfully. And I mean, it's not even a case up for discussion in a way. It's palpably obvious. Climate change is now almost possibly irreversibly with us. It's like a vast network of nuclear bombs just beginning to go off above our heads. It's quite terrifying. And that's the system. Our current wisdom, business logic, have got us to that point. So I think we need to think very profoundly about business logic and why we're here. Did we not need to behave very differently in virtually every aspect of our lives, particularly business? So you can see that I'm quite passionate about this, and what it's helped me enormously in thinking through EO and what to do with the business, to fall back on this fundamental conviction that business needs to change if the world's going to change, if we're going to survive. And just one last thing to say, I've been quite influenced by the Quaker movement.
Right.
As you know better than I do, probably the Quakers owned an enormous number of very successful businesses, banks and chocolate companies, Rowntree's and Fry's and Barclays, etc. What an extraordinary example it is of how to behave. And there's a set of values represented by an identifiable core of human beings in history and from which we can draw. And so back to your original question, I found all that sort of background hugely supportive.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you for sharing that. So just a few final questions as we close off on the podcast today. So just finish the sentence. Employee ownership is?
One, perhaps, of the best ways of ensuring equity in its human sense among the people who've enabled you to work and to prosper.
Love that. Thank you. My biggest EO surprise was?
My biggest CEO,
My
EO
biggest
surprise.
EO surprise.
How extraordinarily successful it can be and has been.
Brilliant. We always ask people on the podcast to recommend a book. Now, you've already recommended one book. Do you have another, or is that your? We'll put it in the show notes. It is a great book. I'm not quite through it yet, but nearly finishing it. But is there any other? Is it that one, or are there any other books that you have read that really influenced your thinking around perhaps the subject you just talked about?
I'm gonna cheat. I'm going to tell you about a book I've just finished called Mother Mary, Come to Me.
Okay.
By Arundhati Roy.
Right.
Who you
Tell
know.
me about the book.
It's her latest book. It's a stunner, which buttresses my commitment to the idea of individuality, sticking to values, whatever it costs you. And it can come right in the end. It's an extraordinary book. And another book, I'm going to cheat. I'm going to reach out and pick it up. Years ago, I published a book with a Quaker friend, an architect who'd retired. He did most of the work. I did the editing and the publishing. And working deeply on that. By the way, I was doing all these things while I was publishing travel books. We had another series of books about the environment. This was our best one. And just working on it and going through the subject matter, from fishing to agriculture to climate change to ocean currents to banking, etc., I learned so much. And again, it's an enormous source of moral and intellectual support. And if I can hold it up, you can only get it from secondhand bookshops, the internet. The Little Earth Book, I think it contains within it an astonishing array of simple solutions to some of our problems. And I found learning those things myself, the process of learning was very immensely character building, if you like, and opinion building.
Wonderful. Wait, as the podcast host, I don't usually get the opportunity to. I sometimes talk about books that I've enjoyed reading throughout the podcast, but there's a book I'd like to promote on our time together, and that's a book called Travelling Light by Alastair Sawday. So it's a truly wonderful book. So when Alastair and I met in preparation for the podcast, he said, "You do know, I have a book that talks about my story." And every year, I've been fortunate for the last 10 years, I take a week off, which I call my retreat week, which when I was CEO, it was a opportunity to just go away and reflect. And I always take a book with me. Last year I did, I've talked quite a bit about a book called Die with Zero, which is a really interesting book. But this year we just met and Alastair recommended his book to me or thought it'd be a nice one. And as a sort of traveling companion, I go to Austria every year and I walk in the mountains. I found it a truly delightful read from the minute I picked it up to the minute I finished it. So I'm going to put that in the show notes, Alastair, and I think it's a must read for anyone who it just took me back to the first days that we used to travel through France and some of the wonderful stories and anecdotes and stories about pilchards, you'll remember, were truly wonderful. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Just as we finish off the podcast, we have a thing called the CEO Confessional. And you have a choice here. You have a moment of honesty, which could be something like a decision that you regret, a moment of self-doubt. So that's a moment of honesty. An unfiltered story. So that could be time when you had to fire someone, personal sacrifice. Or the final one is a secret struggle. And that's something like a number of people have shared imposter syndrome. It could be balancing work and family. So from those three, moment of honesty, an unfiltered story, or a secret struggle, anything there that particularly resonates with you that you could share as we conclude on our podcast together?
So the moment this is all in with relationship to EO and
yes, all more EO, but also just your business journey in general. A sort of
I mentioned somebody who came to me as a bilingual secretary. Well, she stayed with me for 30 years. And we truly loved each other. She was a wonderful woman. And so the honesty is really, we never had one row in 30 years. And she ended up as editor, as Well, she ran the publishing company, really. So the honesty is that I think she should take the vast majority of the credit for the success of Sawdays. Unsung heroine. And there very often is, behind the average man doing well, a woman rolling her eyeballs, isn't there?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And she just is, in many ways, the secret to my success, because she also made me very happy. Going to work every day was a pleasure. And she created a mood which was so far the opposite of corporate, that we could all just settle into being human beings who are working really well, rather than functionaries. Firing somebody is an amusing story. Telling one, I recruited somebody for a technical job on a Friday and said, we're off this weekend for a company away weekend. Would you like to come? So he joined in. During a game we played, he revealed himself as a fascist.
Oh, wow.
Wow. I fired him on Monday morning. And I never felt more justified and more decisive. So that's a silly little story. Secret struggle. I think I went away too much. I left which meant my wife had to take quite a lot of the burden, small children, particularly in the early days, although she was incredibly supportive. Just so the struggle was finding the balance. But again, a confession, I loved my work. I've always loved it. And I always had permission from my colleagues, and Annie particularly, one I mentioned, to go off and do other things. I spent an enormous amount of time doing other things, trying to set up other business ventures, by the way.
Right. Yeah.
But also working with the charitable sector. Sometimes people wonder whether I was working at Sawdays at all, which takes me back to Annie and what she deserves. I don't think I've been very, very startling, have I, in my revelations?
That's incredibly helpful, and there was no requirement whatsoever to be startling. So I've so enjoyed our conversation. I knew I was going to from the moment we met as we prepared for this, but really appreciate you sharing your stories, the good and the not so good. As I say, sometimes it's our warts and all challenges that actually are the most profound, but the most helpful to others on this journey or contemplating this journey. So really would like to thank you for your time this morning, and whatever you're doing for the rest of the day. Hope it's a good one. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. You've done it beautifully. Thank you.